right, so moving right along here, we're going to look at aestheticism, which is a later movement, primarily in the 1880s and 1890s, but it was the next movement that overtly discussed art after pre-Raphaelitism, and we'll primarily look at it as exemplified in the work of Oscar Wilde, who's definitely the most famous aesthete from late Victorian society. And really, we'll talk about aestheticism, but really this is a lecture about Oscar Wilde because he was just such a brilliant, ingenious, fun, creative writer that it's always fun to study Oscar Wilde. So I'm excited for that opportunity. On his background, he was born in Dublin and grew up there. So he's really an Irish writer, even though he lived most of his adult life and literary life in London. He started out studying the classics at Trinity College and did so well there he won a scholarship to Oxford, where he established a brilliant academic record. So he's really known, or was at the time, before he got into writing poetry and novels and plays, he was really known for his academic achievements. While at Oxford, he studied the aesthetic theories of John Ruskin and Walter Pater. And so Ruskin, we didn't read Ruskin, but he was pretty prominent prose writer during the Victorian period who had put forth theories about art. And then Walter Pater, who we didn't read either, was also the biggest proponent of the aesthetic movement. Wilde's the most famous writer from the aesthetic movement, but Walter Pater's really the founder of it and biggest proponent of it. And the aesthetic movement, it's more complicated than what I'm about to say, but to put it succinctly, it was a movement that emphasized art for art's sake. So the Victorians were very preoccupied with social concerns, and they liked reading novels and poems and plays about societal issues. It's not that the aesthetes didn't believe that art, they didn't believe it shouldn't convey important ideas, but they didn't think the main focus should be these societal issues. So they didn't write social problem novels, whereas most Victorian novels were social problem novels. They wrote things that they thought were beautiful. And you really see that with Wilde. It's exemplified most in the importance of being earnest. We'll talk about that more. After graduating from Oxford in 1878, when he was 24, he moved to London, and there were other Irish writers there, like George Bernard Shaw and William Butler Yeats, and so that was initially very good for him. In 1882, he visited America and gave a long and successful lecture tour. So up until 1895, which we'll talk about what happened in 1895 in a few minutes, he was a very successful, popular, well-respected writer during his time. He was the spokesperson for aestheticism, a dazzling conversationalist, incredibly witty. I have to imagine that if you were at a party and you ran into Oscar Wilde, you would not want to leave his presence the whole night. He was one of those people who could just on the spot say the most funny, clever, and witty things. He is known for just having these incredibly clever and witty statements. If you just Google Oscar Wilde quotes, you will find some of the funniest, best statements. There's a couple in the introduction to our textbook. My favorite has always been this one. He said, decadence is nostalgia for the present. And the aesthete movement of the 1890s was very much associated with decadence. I just think that encapsulates what decadence really is very well. He was also an actor, performed in plays. He loved being in the spotlight, having the attention on him, and so he dressed very flamboyantly, intentionally. His aesthetics theory still inform critical theory today. So much like Matthew Arnold, who we just studied a couple of lectures ago, all within this one lesson, he is in those critical theory classes I hope you take. Again, where I didn't have you read his critical theory for sake of time, but we'll talk on the next slide about how it informs his writing. And finally, I really should devote more than one bullet point to this, so I'll be doing a lot of talking here. But in 1895, he was imprisoned for homosexuality. If you can believe it or not, things have changed a lot in just over 100 years, 120 years. And homosexuality was actually considered a crime then. And so what happened in 1895, a number of things. One, on a more positive note, he composed The Importance of Being Earnest in 1895, and it was performed in 1895 and was very successful. And so that's considered like his crowning achievement. So The Importance of Being Earnest was his crowning achievement. We'll talk about why when we study the play more specifically in a minute. And he composed it and it was performed in 1895, and it ran for a while and it would have kept running if not for the issues that ensued. Um, and even though he did write some things after Ernest, they were informed by his trial and imprisonment, and so Ernest is really his crowning achievement and last true work. I'm very curious to what his literary career would have been like if it had gone on unimpeded. Um, but essentially, what happened is this: Wilde had a wife and two children, but even though he had that relationship, he was still very open about the fact that he had relationships with men. He didn't try to hide it. And to his own detriment, he became kind of the image of homosexuality for about a century or so, until the LGBTQ movement picked up steam in the U.S. in the 1980s and 1990s. So the father of his lover brought charges against him, and Wilde and was really the father of his lover was really a terrible person, it seems like, by all account, and brought these charges against him and really harassed him. And Wilde responded by suing for libel, but he lost the suit and was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor in prison, and that really changed him. He died just a few years after he got out, and so that really changed his life and caused it to end in a tragic way, which is really disappointing because, like I said, he was at his peak when he wrote The Importance of Being Earnest. But that play accomplished a great deal. So let's take a look at it now. And Wilde would want us to read it and enjoy it. So, what are some of the ideas behind it? Well, Wilde himself said that the central idea is that we should treat all the trivial things of life seriously and all the serious things of life with sincere and studied triviality. So, really, as a central message, this play is about not taking things seriously, and we'll see why that's important in a minute. He also said he was pleased with the bright and happy tone, but he hoped it might have had a higher seriousness of intent. And so, a big issue for Wilde all throughout his career was reconciling the trivial with the serious. And contrary to this statement, I think most scholars and critics would agree he achieves that. And the importance of being earnest. And even though it's his most lighthearted, funniest, seemingly least serious play, by doing it that way, he actually conveys some of his most important messages. The play deconstructs Victorian moral and social values. It empties manners and morals of their underlying sense to create a nominalist world. And so the world of the play is one where morality and even the meaning of words are defined by the characters rather than by Victorian morals. Some other important themes are switching identities and doubleness. You have a guy from the country who pretends to be someone else in the city to visit the woman he loves there, and a guy from the city who pretends to be someone else in the country to visit the woman he loves there, who happens to be the ward of the first guy, and they're best friends. So there's all this doubling, switching of identities, and that's central to the play, and that's sort of how the play undermines Victorian morals and values, because as we've talked about before, the Victorians lived in this unstable, changing world, and the society was so rigid in part, and in part it's understandable because they wanted to stabilize what seemed unstable. But here you have what I think with Wilde is the shift from Victorianism to modernism, because you have a writer who's really saying, let's embrace the unstable. Even the Victorian Even the most reforming of Victorian writers, who were the most anti-Victorian writers, none of them really embraced the instability of the Victorian period the way Wilde did. He embraced that, he loved it, rather than wanting to contain or control it. Um, Along these lines, there's the term bunburying, which is a really fun term that comes from this play, because so Jack, the guy from the country who goes in disguise in the city, he uses the name Ernest. But Algernon, his best friend, and as later we'll find out brother, um, when he goes and uses his false ID in the country, he uses the name Bunbury. And so Bunburying has actually become a verb and is used to describe avoiding social responsibility. Because of the two of them, Algernon is the one from the high upper class of society, and he doesn't want to be a part of all the social engagements and obligations that go along with that high position in society. So he has this fake name and uses it to basically get out of social responsibility. Um, of having to attend all these social gatherings with his aunt. And so bunburying is just a fun word that's come out of there now. And then the biggest thing it probably critiques is the Victorian idea of earnestness, since that's the name. We talked before about how the Victorian period, as embodied by its queen, was all about energy and work ethic and morality. And so earnestness was the, if you wanted to sum all that up in one word, it would be earnestness. Earnestness was like the central word, the central idea of the Victorian period. The more earnest you were, the better Victorian you were. And with the playing with the words here and the name of the play, Wilde really critiques that idea. Let's look at a little bit more a little more, and how he does that in a little more detail. I'm going to take a minute and talk about the subtitle of the play. No one ever talks about the subtitle, but I think it's really important. It's called The Importance of Being Earnest, a trivial comedy for serious people. So that subtitle underscores how the play conveys important themes specifically by not taking itself seriously. So there is an important message here, but the play itself is not very serious, and that was Wilde's intent. It also refers to how he refused to play the game of the other playwrights of the day. And so his fellow Irishman and playwright George Bernard Shaw really did not like Wilde and really critiqued him. And in the next lesson, we'll look at Shaw's play Miss Warren's Profession, which is about prostitution and the woman question and the new woman. And so while they would have had some similar values, Shaw was very much, plays need to be about social issues and social reform. And while Wilde wouldn't have been opposed to those reforms, he would have disagreed about art for art's purpose. And and so he would think the art, the beauty of the words, the language of the play was much more important than a social message. And so that's where they disagreed. And so by calling it a trivial comedy for serious people, he's saying, I'm not going to do what everyone else does. The social problem play, the kind that Shaw wrote, was the prominent type of play of the day. And so he was openly saying, I'm not going to go along with that, which was so much the way Wilde was. He was someone who was very direct. He didn't hide his relationships with men. He didn't try to do his plays the way other people did. He wanted to write what he wanted to write for art's sake. Some other interesting things that come up when we look at the language of the play is the emphasis on food and why food. You know, Algernon is obsessed with eating these cucumber sandwiches, and cucumber sandwiches have become ever famous because of this play. And Algernon says, yes, but you must be serious about it. I hate people who are not serious about meals. It is so shallow of them. So what does the food do? Why is it so important? Well, it gives physicality to the humor. Going beyond the language, since this is a comedy is so often physical. The food is one way of bringing that physicality into it. Next up, in looking at the language, we have the question of, well, how does Wilde critique the idea of Victorian earnestness? One way he does that is through hyperbole or exaggeration. It's another comedic technique here. So, in how desperately Gwendolyn and Cecily want to marry someone named Ernest, you see how he's critiquing that. It's exaggerated. It's a similar technique to Jane Austen, whereas in Love and Friendship, she has the women fainting all the time, like constantly. She's really making fun of fainting. Here, he's really making fun of earnestness by having them emphasize wanting to marry a man named Ernest so much. And so Gwendolyn says the only really safe name is Ernest. In other words, you have to be very earnest to be a Victorian. And so it's making fun of that. And then Cecily says, I pity any poor married woman whose husband is not named Ernest. Again, it's exaggeration. How many men are actually named that? So through exaggeration, he's poking fun at the Victorian emphasis on Ernest. Um, Another important point is Lady Bracknell represents Victorian society's rules and rituals. So she's really kind of, you could say, almost like the villain here. And things have to work out um, in this completely ridiculous way they do in order to subvert her. Um, but if there's any character in the play that represents the moral Victorian world, it's her. Everyone else is really more emblematic of the nominalist world Wilde creates and believes in. Um, there's this very typical plot. It was so common in Victorian novels. If you sat down and read a bunch of Victorian novels, they'd have this very similar plot where you have an orphan, and that orphan goes through some struggles, and at the end of the novel learns the secret origin of their birth, and it turns out they're actually from a noble birth. And so that's what happens to Jack here. But it happens in this ridiculous way because the governess here mixes up a book and a baby, which are two things would typically not be confused. And so it makes fun of this plot that you saw so commonly in Victorian novels. And really it's an important point Wilde's making here. It's not just a joke, because when those novels end that way, what they're really doing is taking a story that could be subversive and making it very Victorian. They're saying, rather than saying an orphan or someone from outside um, society, an outsider, rather than showing the kind of progress that person can make, they're saying, well, it's okay if they achieve this because all along they were really of noble birth. And so the way Lady Bracknell agrees to let Jack marry Gwendolyn when she knows of his noble birth, again, that's exaggerated to make this point. Well, it's not really progress or anything good if you're just saying they really were part of the society all along. They weren't really an outsider. And so Wilde, this is one example of Wilde, through being completely ridiculous, not being serious at all, makes a really important point, which is the genius of this play. The play is entirely ridiculous. There's nothing serious about it, but it makes these important points. Um, to emphasize that, my last main idea here before we close is the play shows a commitment to not taking things seriously. So there's never a moment where we make a switch and say, now it gets serious. It's comedic and ridiculous the whole way through. In fact, the last lines of the play emphasize that more than anything else. So when Jack learns, the other thing he learns is that his name is actually Ernest. They never knew his name because he was this orphan, right? So what he actually learns his name is Ernest. It turns out he hasn't been lying the whole time, even though he thinks he's been lying the whole time. And so Wilde embraces the idea of lying, you could say. Jack says, Gwendolyn, it is a terrible thing for a man to find out suddenly that all his life he's been speaking nothing but the truth. Can you forgive me? And Gwendolyn says, I can, for I feel that you are sure to change. So basically, she says, it turns out you're telling the truth. That's not good. I'm ready for you to start lying. So again, it's just ridiculous. And Wilde's poking fun at the rigidity of Victorian society here. Um, is he saying people should lie all the time? No, but he's playing with the ideas of what counts for truth or not. Um, and the final lines of the poem are the most ironic. Lady Bracknell says, now that she knows Jack's her nephew, my nephew, you seem to be displaying signs of triviality. On the contrary, Aunt Augusta, I've now realized for the first time in my life the vital importance of being earnest. So you could read this as saying, yes, he's embracing the Victorian value of earnestness. No, it's another joke because him coming from noble birth is the only way he can marry Gwendolyn, and he really wants to marry Gwendolyn. So it's another joke. It's good to be earnest because it means he can marry her. He's not saying it's good. It's good to be named Ernest, is what he's really saying. He's not saying it's good to be earnest in a Victorian sense of the word. And so the spelling here and the wordplay really illustrates Wilde's values of frivolity and poking fun and um, aestheticism of art for art's sake rather than for a social message. But some important messages do come through. So this is what I think we should take away from the play. In mocking earnestness, Wilde critiques the rigidity of Victorian rules, rituals, and regulations, which caused him to suffer oppression in his own life. Um, he wrote this before he went to prison, but he knew he was a smart guy, so he knew what living openly as a homosexual could cost him, and he still went ahead and lived that way. Um, so he openly, challenged the Victorian rules. But I think what he's arguing for here, or arguing against, or critiquing, is the rigidity of Victorian rules. He's not saying everything is wrong with Victorian society and all their beliefs and values are bad, but he's saying they're too inflexible. And so it's not that earnestness is a bad thing, but earnestness was often associated with Victorian rigidity, moral rigidity. And so he's mocking that to say, be a little more flexible. And that's, I think, the essence of this play. What, through all of its joking, all of its lack of seriousness, is the important point he makes. And this really embodies the temperament of the 1890s. The earnestness of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, her husband, embodied, the 1830s to the 1880s. But in the 1890s, as we talked about in lesson 4, was marked by the fact that Prince Edward, their oldest son, would soon become king because um, Albert passed and Victoria was very old, and so they knew Edward would become king, and he did in 1901 when Victoria died. And he had very different values. He was much more like Wilde. He was much more morally laid back than his parents, and so Victorian values were starting to fade. And so the play is really emblematic of this, and a sign of the times in 1895. And so, why is it the crowning achievement? Because it's completely frivolous. His earlier works, his other plays like The Ideal Husband, and his one novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which if you've ever read it, it's very serious. They mix frivolity and seriousness, and you had to take them serious, even though they were very funny. Whereas this play is completely ridiculous. It never takes itself seriously. But the mocking of earnestness, the critique of Victorian rigidity, comes through very clearly here, more clearly than in those other works. And so because he's able to fully embrace the triviality and make it fully comedic while still conveying an important message, really conveying the important message because he fully embraces the triviality, that's what makes this such a special play and his crowning achievement compared to the earlier but still interesting works he did.